Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Ben Ilegbodu. I have a quick question to start off. So just to check, how many people here are using React? Here, okay, great, most people. And how about using Next.js? How many people? Okay, so maybe 2/3 or something like that. So I've been using Next.js for a number of years now, and I got really into trying to understand how it all worked, right? So went into some details, delved into things. So this talk is basically a distillation, I will say, of everything that I've learned, okay? So if you are interested in getting the slides, you're totally free to do that. I have a link at the bottom in the footer that you can always see it there, or you can go to my Twitter page. But I have this huge QR code that you should be able to scan from space and be able to get the links as well, because I like to have lots of links in the slides too. Okay, so when React came out, one of the cool things about it at the time was that it supported multiple types of rendering. So the tools back then, like jQuery, Backbone, those sorts of things, they attached their UI directly to the DOM. And the state was in the DOM too with data attributes. But React was different because we could build the UI and then render it to whatever renderer we needed there. So React Native works because the renderer is a mobile device. Netflix or other TV applications have their own proprietary renderers so that you can use React, but render in a TV environment. And of course, here we have the most common renderer, which is to render the app out to the DOM. So there was another type of renderer, the ability to render to a string. And Next.js, it capitalized on that ability to be able to render into a string on the server. And this introduced the whole isomorphic React, if you had ever heard of that, which was the ability to render using the same UI to render that we use in the browser to also render on the server. And at a high level, what would happen is that on the server, it would generate all the UI, create a string, return that in the server response, and then on the client, hydrate it to add all of the event handlers and things like that there. And then around, I want to say Next 9, this was 2019 or so, Next switched from being predominantly a server rendering platform and wanting to focus on pre-rendering. So as much as we could pre-render before the server even runs, that was the focus there, so that in order to make things even faster and faster. And it used something called the pages router to do page-based routing. And then now with Next, let's see what it had been, Next 13, I believe, two years ago, they introduced the app router, which was a different way to accomplish effectively the same thing, but give us more functionality in terms of how we do layouts, templates, routing in that sense. But when it came out, it was a little, I don't know, clumsy, I guess I'll say, even though it was made the default. But last year, I'll say, is when it really became available to be available for prime time. We could actually really use it and do everything that we wanted to do. So I will be talking about the app router and how we can do different types of rendering there, okay? So actually, hold on. Let me start this. I'm gonna build our server, our Next app here. So it's building here at the bottom. We can see it's building stuff, and we'll come back to that. And I gave you a little preview before. Can I get everyone to stand up real quick with me? I need you to humor me. Okay, we're all gonna stand up. You know, I see lots of people have coffee, you're getting kind of tired. So what I like to do in the beginning is to do 10 squats, just like this, all together, okay? Yes, we are definitely gonna do that. Okay, I'll count us out. And we'll make it 0 based, since this is JavaScript, so we'll start with a 0, okay? Here you go, ready? 0, 1. Yep, we're doing it. 2, 3. Ooh, y'all are getting deep. Hold on. 4. Okay. 5. Almost there. 6, 7, 8, 9, and I got you. I got you. Off by 1 error. See, that's what gets us. Okay. All right. Thank you for that. So to formally introduce myself, like I said, my name is Ben Ilegbodu. I am a Christian, a husband of 1, a father of 3. That's my wife, Rashida. We've been married for 14 years now. My oldest daughter, Simone, she's the one next to me. She is 10 years old. Our middle daughter, Avery, with the glasses, she's 8. And my mini-me, the bottom, Asher, he is 5 years old. So we live in a suburb of Houston called Manville, Texas. And we just moved there. We used to live in the Bay Area for a really long time. I am a senior software engineer at Netflix. So I work on our TV application. We use React to build that. So I'm familiar with the different types of rendering. And I'm also a Google developer expert in web technologies. Fantastic. Okay, so enough about me. Let's talk about this various types of rendering. So I have this demo blog that I want to show us. So let me actually get that running. So we'll see here, though, that during the build process, a bunch of different routes were pre-built ahead of here. So a lot of HTML pages and such. So we'll be paying attention to that. But let me go ahead and start it. And it is starting, and it's already ready. I wish my real next apps built that quickly. Okay, so let me show off the app real quick, sorry. So here's the blog right here. So it's got a bunch of fake blog posts here. So you got the hero, you have some stories, the remainder of the blog posts and such. So I'll be taking a look at a single blog post and we'll discuss how it all works. I used Gemini AI to generate the content. I never even looked to see what it says, so hopefully it's right about what it's talking about. And then so you have the main information, and then suggested or recommended stories, and then a footer down here with the date, which will make sense in a second. Okay, so let's talk about the different ways of rendering. So the first one I want to talk about is called client-side rendering, or CSR. When we were building React applications, 5 years ago or more, when React just came out, this was the predominant way of building React applications. We had single-page apps, if you've ever heard of that term. And what happens here is that the page HTML, what the user actually sees, is rendered on the browser, in the browser, for every request. So anytime you hit the page, we'll get down the response and we'll render in the browser. So let's see what that will look like. So here we have our client-side rendering page. As you can see, there was that loading state, and then it finally rendered on the page. So I'll load that again. So the actual, if you look over here to the right, the page actually returned pretty fast in 36 milliseconds is what it says there. But it took a while for the page to actually load. Then it loads, and then later the recommendations load in after that, because I didn't want the page to be blank for very long, or even longer than it already was there. So, and then we can see here at the bottom the date, 11:39 and 17 seconds. Way down there is the current time. And every time I refresh the page, the time changes. So that's 11:39 and 44 seconds. So one other thing, so I said that it retrieves the content on every request, right? So it's always up to date, it's always dynamic. So here is the blog post itself. I can go in, add some exclamation points because I am so excited about mastering layouts and templates in Next.js. And then let me refresh the page. Wait again for it to load. It responded in 23 milliseconds, but now we have the exclamation points here. So immediately the content is there. Anytime I make changes, the content updates, which doesn't really sound like something that's super special, right? It should update, but it'll make sense as we keep going and talking about the other different ways that we can render. So, all right. So there are some advantages of this approach in that the content that we are retrieving can be dynamic. So as you saw, I changed the title of the blog post, and immediately the content changed. Or the content could be user specific. So if it was related to where I live or my account, or the recommendations were based upon what I'm interested. Like that is easy to do with client-side rendered pages because I'm hitting an API and getting that data there. So if you were here for Corey's talk before, he talked about client components and server components. So if you were here, he gave a nice little primer about what all that is. So whenever we add use client here, we're making it a client component because we want to do a browser fetch, or we want to do use browser APIs, for instance, like the location API, things like that. So it's actually pretty difficult to create a CSR page in Next.js because of the way that it works and it wanting to pre-render a lot of things. So I had to go through some hoops, but this is how I ended up making it work. But some challenges with this, which has always been the challenge with client-side rendered pages, is that it has poor SEO because the response only had that loading indicator in it, the HTML request. Everything happened on in the JavaScript. So at this point, Google and other search engines are able to parse or run the JavaScript so they can see the content, but that obviously takes a while, as we saw with the page loading. And then we can't really, there's nothing really to cache either because the page is just blank. So while the initial server time was really fast, it was 26 milliseconds, we saw that the final rendering took a number of seconds. So I probably wouldn't use this for a blog post like we had there. Totally could, but I wouldn't. Instead, client-side rendering is great for interactive dashboards. So think of Figma or our favorite friend Jira. Any of those types of dashboards, perfect for that. Anything that's like highly user-specific, I think is also a great opportunity to use client-side rendering. And then our third-party widgets, right? So if you have a Stripe widget and it runs completely in the browser using browser APIs, then client-side rendering is how that will work. So in the bottom right, I have links there to the example code, which is on GitHub, as well as more docs on client components there. Okay, so that was CSR, client-side rendering. Let's talk about now server-side rendering, SSR, another acronym for us. So that's server-side rendering, or maybe you've known it as dynamic rendering. It's basically how the web has worked for decades, essentially. You have a Python server, Perl server, .NET server, whatever the case may be, render on the server, then the content comes back to the browser. And this happens again for every request. We get back new content, or the content can be different there. So if we go back to our favorite blog post, let's check out this post with server rendering. So I clicked it. It's taken a while to respond, and then it did. Let me run it again. We can see here on the right that the HTML is pending, and then 4.5 seconds is what it says. Let me see if I can make that even bigger. 4.5 seconds is what it said. It took the HTML to load there. So that's a long time for the user to wait to get the response back. But we can see again at the bottom here, 11:44 and 38 seconds. which was exactly when I refreshed the page. And if I refresh it again, just to prove, it loads, and at the bottom, now it's 11:45 and 11 seconds there. So I can go in, I can make changes again. I can say mastering layouts and templates in Next.js. And then we can see that it updates when I reload the page. So again, pending, waiting. It has the question marks, which it should, and then it's loading the recommendations there on the client. So it's actually using a hybrid of SSR and CSR because it loaded the stories on the client there. So that's server-side rendering. It's dynamic. The content can change. And it can also be user specific again. So in the example, you can't really see it from the code, but I'm actually reading the headers of the page in order to generate some of the markup there just for fun. And that ends up being in the app router how we server-side rendering. So we don't have to do anything specific and say, get server-side props like we did with the pages router, or say, I want to use server-side rendering. Essentially, if we access headers or cookies or the query string, we don't want caching, any of those kind of things, Next is able to understand that, okay, I have to server-side render because this is going to be different because it's user-specific, or this is going to be different because they don't want caching and things like that. So that part is nice. We can just await inside of the page, and it takes care of it. So again, the advantages are kind of like client-side rendering, where we can get dynamic content or user-specific, but and the render in the browser is super fast because it has all of the HTML, right? And if you were here in the previous talk with Corey again, the advantage of server-side rendering is that anything that's server-side rendered only, Next doesn't provide the JavaScript for it because of React server components. So now not only is the render on the browser faster because the HTML is already there, it gets to parse less JavaScript as well because nothing is changing on the client. So that's a huge win for browsers, especially if you're on low-end devices. And then it's also SEO friendly because the markup is there. So SEO or social media optimization, your Slack links, your Twitter links, it's able to pull all of that data easily. But then as we saw, the server response time was really slow. So that's one of the challenges that we have to weigh against them. So some good candidates for this: dynamic product pages. So let's say every time you load a page, the product page is going to be different. The product listings are going to be different. Perfect. Server-side render that. Or search results pages, cart and checkout pages. Obviously, those are unique to the user. So great opportunity for server-side rendering there. Okay, so that's two of them. We have client-side rendering. We just talked about server-side rendering. Let's talk about static site generation, right? So that became popular in React during when Gatsby first came out. Anybody here use Gatsby before? Oh, okay. Well, that's probably a good thing. Gatsby was a complete static site generation tool. So everything, and what that means is that the HTML is pre-rendered at build time. So when you saw me run build for Next, that's when all the HTML pages were generated. And that was the only way that you could generate HTML pages initially with Gatsby. So no server-side rendering, anything like that there. Technically, static site rendering came out with Jekyll, if anybody's really been around to use that. But it was in Ruby, so we don't care about Ruby. Okay, so let's go down and let's look at our static site generation app. Whoa, that loaded fast. Look at that. 13 milliseconds, you can see over to the right. The page responded in 13 milliseconds with all of the content already there. Super fast there. But if I go down to the date, it says 11:34. which is when I first built it way at the beginning of the talk. So that's, I don't know, 20 minutes ago, maybe 15 minutes ago. So it's the same file that's been there since the very beginning. And to really show that, I can go in, well, actually first, we can see here that the title doesn't have any of the question marks there. It's the original title. And if I go in and I say, let's not say Next.js, let's just call it Next, because obviously it's in JS. Refresh the page, nothing. It's the exact same as before. It doesn't change there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that. So static site generation, essentially Next does that by default. So if you don't do anything special, you're going to get a statically generated page if you don't look at the cookies, the headers like we were talking about before. So in your page, you just fetch for some data. It'll do that at build time because you're not using any cookies, and you have it pre-rendered there, which is actually pretty nice. So again, this is SEO friendly because the HTML is pre-rendered. It's there right off the bat. And it's also highly cacheable because it's the same file that everyone's going to get, right? So I'm going to get that blog post the same, you're going to get the same thing. And as a result of that, we don't even have to keep it on the server. We can put it in a CDN and have it respond super quick to people there. So because there's only one copy, essentially, of the page, it can be cached everywhere. So the browser render is super fast as well because all the HTML is there. And again, just like server-side rendering, there is less JavaScript because there's nothing happening on the client to do the rendering. But the challenge that's always been around with static site generation is dynamic content. Like, how do we change the content when it needs to change? Or how can we have user-specific data for something that's the same for everyone? So there are a number of different ways that we've solved it. Sometimes you create a shell that has the content, and then on the client, we'll add in some new details if things have changed there. Or the way that Gatsby would run a lot of the times is that there would be a webhook. So anytime something changed, we would tell GitHub to, hey, rebuild the entire site again and deploy it. So whenever one page is changing, now all of a sudden we're rebuilding the whole entire site just to get that one page updated. And if we're also building out tons of blog post pages or tons of product pages, it's also going to be slow to pre-build all of those things. So those have been the challenges with static site generation. So it's super fast, super cacheable, all of those things are great, but then it's hard to make it user specific. So in the end, what makes static sites, well, what makes static pages the best are pages where you're logged out. So that's not user specific. They're logged out pages like marketing pages, maybe even this blog page as well. Static listings of products, those sorts of things are great for it because pretty much it's the same content for everyone there. So those are those three. I've got one more primary one for us. So here's our final acronym. Actually, it won't be our final acronym, but this is the fourth acronym called ISR, or Incremental Static Regeneration. So what it does is those three words, but it just sounds a lot fancier than what it actually is. So in this case, the HTML is regenerated on the server after a timeout. So it's rendered statically, pre-rendered statically, but then after some period of time, it'll be re-rendered on the server. So let's take a look at how that works. So we go in here, incremental static regeneration. So the response also is really fast there. But we see that it has our question marks from before, not the removal of .js. It responded in 9 milliseconds there, and the date is 11:50. So not quite right now, the 5 minutes ago. So what was that about? Well, if I refresh the page, then we're going to see it had the updated content. So the content does update, but not immediately. There's a timeout that happens. So we have the page here. Now I'm going to go and change it to mastering layouts. Let's just say ampersand templates. I go here. I have set a 15-second timeout for it. So I go and change it, and it's like, oh, 15 seconds has passed. Now, and somebody has hit the server. Now let me invalidate the cache. And it's going to take 15 seconds. I'm going to talk for 15 seconds. And then now, whenever I refresh it, now it's there. So what happens is that the first person who gets there after the 15 seconds has passed, they will get the previously cached page. And then next is like, all right, I have to rebuild this in the server in the background. It does whatever it needs to do to rebuild that page. And then the next person that sees it will actually get the real content. So someone's going to get stale data, but everybody else will get the good ones. So if I go in here, change it back, let's add lots of exclamation points. Let's make sure that what I'm saying is true. So refreshed it, that person got the cached version there. It's rebuilding in the background because now 15 seconds has passed, and then it's there. So the nice thing about incremental static regeneration, and if we see the time, that's now, it's kind of like static, right? But it can actually update there. So it can be a little bit dynamic there. So it's also SEO friendly because all of the HTML is in the page. So it responds super fast as a result of it being pre-rendered. It's already has been rendered by the time someone makes the request there. And again, because it's pre-rendered, all of the content was there on the server, there's less JavaScript needed unless we're doing some extra interactivity on the page. And because of this revalidate that you add as an export, you can periodically update the data. So I could set that to 1 second. I could set that to 60 times 10 for that to be 10 hours, or anything in between, anything more than that. I've never tried anything less than 1 second before, but maybe that will work. Half 500 milliseconds, 4.5, something along those lines. So it has lots of the same positive and negatives as static site generation, except for this ability to incrementally or intermittently update the data. So user-specific content is still a challenge because it's still the same page for everyone that they get. And again, the build times can be slow because it's building over everything. But the nice part with this is that we could decide, all right, our site has 1,000 product pages. These 50 or these 100 are the most popular ones. So we'll pre-render those at build time and then let the other 900, the other 950 be rendered on demand when somebody requests them there. So these types of pages are really good for headless CMSs where the content is not changing every time, but is going to change on every once in a while. So you have a product page, you have a blog post, you change the title, you edit some of the content. Well, we want that to be reflected at some point. So I could have it be 15 seconds or 2 minutes or whatever. So there'll be a 2-minute delay until the content is updated, but maybe that's okay. Or I have a product page that has a price. Maybe it's okay that the price is static and incorrect, but then on the client, we actually will update it with the actual price and such. So headless CMS pages, product listing pages, those sorts of things are great opportunities for those. But there's also something called on-demand incremental static regeneration, or ODISR, okay? Remember that. And basically, what that is, it's similar to the um, webhooks situation, except it happens on a per page basis. So in your CMS, your headless CMS, you can make a change to the blog post, and then you can tell Next through an API, hey, this page has changed. Okay, so revalidate or invalidate the cache for this specific page, and then it'll be done in the background. And in that case, the first person who comes after that will actually get the updated content there. So it's the difference between setting a number, which is a cache timeout, or being able to explicitly um, talk about it there. So this blog post, not this blog post, these docs here on incremental static regeneration talks about that as well. Okay, so we talked about these four kind of high-level ways of rendering, right? So SSG, static site generation, server-side rendering, incremental static regeneration, and client-side rendering. So here are some suggestions if you had a website, how you could split up those types of rendering. The nice thing is that Next.js isn't just a static site generator like Gatsby was. It's not just server-side rendering like the original Next version was. It's not client-side rendering like Create React used to be, or still is if you used it. It can be all of those different things, a hybrid app, and certain pages can do one thing, another page can do another thing. And I just talked about things at a high level, right? These high level renderings, but there's all these kind of micro optimizations and micro rendering you can do as well to have the most optimized page. So even a given page could be server-side rendered and then client-side rendered afterwards to show more information on the page there. So, like I mentioned, there are other things that you can do. So there are layouts and templates that you can do in Next.js that's new with the app router. So it allows us to have a layout that's shared among different routes. So if we actually go here, this footer right here is actually a layout template, and it's common across all of the different routes. So before we would have a layout component and we would render it on every different page, but now with the layout.tsx or layout.js, it can have the common space and then we render the pages in between there. And then there is component composition. So we've been using server components behind the hood. That's how Next.js renders server side. And whenever you have a client component with the use client, you can't render server components within that. It becomes the boundary and everything underneath is client rendered. Well, that's unfortunate because like I said, if something is server rendered, then we don't have to pull in the JS for it. So it'd be unfortunate that we have a page that has state or whatever like that, and then all the components underneath it are just normal renderers, and we have to pull in all the JavaScript for those. So there are patterns, the slot pattern is what it's called, or one of the ways it's called, where we can have a client-side component. I don't have a code example of this, but a component, and you have slots like children or section 1, section 2, section 3, and you can put server components into those places there. So I'll have a link to the docs there, but what it does is it optimizes the render of the page. So there's that. A third one is there's loading UI and streaming. So if you're here with Corey earlier as well, he kind of showcased some of those loading indicators, right? So built-in suspense boundaries, so you can load things in, and then once they load in, then the UI is there. And we can also leverage streaming. If we're rendering so much on the server, then obviously it's going to take a while to get that response back. You see the loading indicator, stuff like that. But React, server components, and Next.js work together so that we can actually stream from the server content instead of waiting for the whole entire response HTML to be generated. And React has a lot of that. Next.js has lots of that built in there. So another kind of small way that we can tweak our pages to render a little bit differently there. There is partial pre-rendering. So this is still experimental with React 19. It's in beta still, so it's experimental in Next.js. But it's the ability to not run into that issue that I was talking about with use client or client components and server components, being able to combine them on the same route. And finally, there are server actions. So server actions aren't exactly around rendering, but they have to do with forms, which are UI, and especially how forms are submitted. So again, Corey and I just had this nice symbiosis, I guess. He talked a little bit about server actions and how we can post instead of using the on-submit event, actually using a form action and then submitting it to an async function, server-side function there. So it's kind of going back to the way that the web used to work before with HTML submissions there. So there's all these different ways that we can augment our pages at a high level with things that are specific. So actually, Dustin, he is giving a talk tomorrow here at 10 o'clock about server components and going into more of the details, kind of how all the things that Next kind of gives us for free, how those actually work in React. And he'll be talking about server actions as well. So if you're kind of interested in how those things work, the details of how we can use them in a Next.js app, or even how we could use it outside of Next.js, totally check that out there. Okay, so you'll have to get these slides, obviously, to be able to click on these links there. But the first one is the actual repo with all the examples, the code examples. So if you're trying to figure out, oh, well, how do I make an ISR page in the app router? Or what's best practices for static site generation, where I can use them. Totally check out the repo. And then the rest of these are links to the docs. Next.js docs, there's so many different things on there that you can read about different aspects. So those things I talked about at the end, layout templates, component composition, you can check those things out as well. Cool. Okay, so hopefully, whether you've been using Next for a long time, just starting to use Next, like hopefully there was some things that came out for you. My goal really was for y'all to take time and analyze your pages. Maybe there are opportunities where you could leverage ISR instead of using static site generation, or realizing that maybe I should use server-side rendering for this because of the benefits that I'll get from not loading in JavaScript. Like those sorts of things, we can take an inventory of our pages to see that we're rendering the right way. So I'll be around for the rest of the conference. Feel free to find me, ask me questions and things like that, bounce ideas. Happy to talk about those things. With that, I'm done. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Can you share some of the coding examples, or like how do you do the setup for which pages are server and which pages are client side?
How do you set it up, you're saying?
Yeah, like if you just walk through a couple of the examples. I haven't really worked with Connect.
Okay, yeah, I can do that. Actually, I can show you up here unless there are other people who want to look at it. But I can show it to you. So, but if anybody wants to leave, you're totally welcome to as well. So let's go through the different types of pages here. Okay, so here's our app folder. So it starts with the app folder. Hopefully that's readable. the app folder right here. And let's take the CSR example, right? So I have, this is the page, the overall page here. Um, and what I did is I have a contents component there. And normally I wouldn't do anything like this, but I was trying to force it to be um, a client component, which is why I did the use client there. And then from there, it's kind of how we've done um, React code before. So uh, it starts off with trying to get posts with post state, but in the beginning, because I haven't loaded it in, post is null or undefined. So what we get is this loading state here. And then once it loads in with the asynchronous request right here, then it gets set and it gets rendered there. So that's kind of like the standard way we used to do things. But it's actually, like I mentioned, quite hard to do with Next.js because everything it wants you to do by default is not that way. So if I jump over, though, I show that just to see the hoops that we had to jump through. But for this would be a static site or statically rendered page here. So I go in and they make the request for whatever page they wanted. I get the post. I make a API request under the hood to get the post right there. And then I render the content right there. So effectively, this is a fetch call behind the scenes. I just have wrapped it in a method. And it gets rendered out with the content, the header, the post header, the recommendations, everything like that. And when the page gets built or the app gets built, all of these pages get automatically pre-rendered. And they get pre-rendered because of this generate static params. So because every blog post is a separate URL, which let me show you that actually. So here is the URL of it. It's slash posts, that is tiny, slash posts.isr, and then the slug of the post there. So if you haven't used Next.js before, you put the slug right here, I'm on the right side over here, a bracket that says that, hey, this is going to be able to take dynamic URLs there. So, and then what Next.js will do is we'll take that param slug and give it to us, and then that's how we can figure out what page to render. So then going back to the generate static params, I can tell Next.js, well, here are all of the pages I want to pre-render. So I'm getting all of the slugs by reading all of the markdown files and telling it pre-render all of these pages. So I'm doing all of them, but I could do, a subset of them. I could, slice and do whatever the case may be, some of them there. And that's how it generates the pages there. Questions on this before I keep going? Is that making sense a little? Okay. And I mentioned in comments here, it's static because I'm not looking at cookies or headers or things of that nature there. And even something like, I don't think I mentioned this, but even something like being able to return a not found is a lot easier in the app router than the pages router. So if I don't find it, it just returns a not found page. In the app router, I can define what the not found page looks like, but by default, it'll just return a 404 style page there. So, and then let's look at the SSR version of it. So it's very similar to the version before. I'm still getting the slug from the params that Next gives me, but I was forcing it to be server-side rendered by looking at the headers. And by looking at the headers, then it becomes server-side rendered. I don't even think I was using the headers for anything useful. Oh, I was just telling it if it's IE, it's not found. because it shouldn't be. So that was just for fun, but that's how I forced it to be server-side rendered. So if I, needed to look at the cookies to get the user ID and then do something specific, that's what I would do there. And then next we'll say, oh, okay, this needs to be server-side rendered because it needs to be unique per user and such. So really, the only difference between the static generated code and the server code is this line right here, and it does something completely different as a result. Everything else is the exact same. Query string, exactly. You do query string params. It's also part of the params object, or could be part of the params object, and it's just query instead of params. Yeah. Yep. Because it can't do that statically. It knows that. So yeah, query params. Um, if you're making an API request but telling it not to cache, um, if you're using the headers, query parameters, all of those types of things. Yep.
So the like file structure, there's just for organization for the demo. It's not for.
Oh, like putting CSR in it? Yeah, that's just so I could have different pages that effectively do the same thing. This would just be app/posts/slug and then page.tsx. So it has to be named page, which again was helpful for the app router because there would be times where I would want to have helper components just for the page, but I couldn't put them in the same folder because it would think that that's also a page because it treated every component in the folder as pages. So now with the new app router, that's no longer the case. And then lastly, with ISR, this is similar to the SSG version again, but it's, again, this line that makes the difference. So it knows that after 15 seconds, it can invalidate the cache and rebuild it there.
Did you have a example for the like on content change update?
On content change. Oh, okay. You mean the on demand? I didn't have an example of that. No. Yeah. So there's a different property that you have to set to tell it to do that, and then there's an API that you have to hook in that you can call for that next will expose that you can call there. So that's a little bit more convoluted to do, obviously, but it's effectively the same thing so that it doesn't have to rebuild every 15 seconds because if it doesn't change, it changes one time after 23 hours and the next time after 23 minutes, like you don't want to have it periodically refreshing every 15 seconds if the content isn't changing there. So, and then I also mentioned that there is a layout. So there's a root layout here where I define all of the meta tags and fun things like that, but then also have the footer built into it. So now every page is going to have the footer as part of it by default because of the root layout. And then the page contents are actually stored or rendered, rather, right there for every page. So, and then next, when I'm navigating around here, is not re-rendering the footer because it knows it's there. So it is able to keep page Chrome as you're clicking through instead of having to re-render the entire pages. Stuff like that.
So for all those, even though like client side one has a footer there.
Yeah, yeah. So the client side one, the footer's there while it's waiting to load the actual thing. So there are some things, even in the client side ones, there's still something that's pre-rendered. It's just very, very minimal there. Yeah, these are all great questions. Uh, I mean, we've got time. People can leave if they so choose. I think, unless other people have questions, you can keep listening to his questions and my answers. Sure, keep going.
All right. What's the routing look like? Where do you specify the router, or is it just where you do the directory and it shows you?
Yeah, so it's file-based routing. So yes, there's app router provides more complicated ways of defining it, but at a base, it's file-based. So each folder is a subroute, which is why we have the slash post CSR here, and then this is the bracket slug. So if I wanted to, I'm not going to do it, but if I wanted to add a subfolder under slug, so it was posts slash layout templates slash edit, because I can edit the post now, I can add a subfolder that's edit under there. So makes it a little easy. At least visually, I can see the routes and such. But there are fancier ways where you can have things grouped, but still have the URL be different. There's all kinds of cool things we can do now with it.
If you were doing like index.html, would that just keep it so there's not, or is that what the page.tsx is? Those are all.
Yeah, those are effectively the index.html pages there, page.tsx. I have no idea what would happen if I added HTML to this. Oh, well, still works. I guess it still pulls the same page there, I think. Maybe it doesn't. Oh, still loading. So maybe not. Maybe the way. Yeah. Yes, right. Good check.
We had a rewrite in the next config.
Mhm. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure I'm just reading the slug. So it probably thinks the slug now is layout templates.html, which obviously it's not. It was simplistic. But yes, in the next config, you add a rewrite to remove the HTML extension.
Can you use the slug as a, like a query string frame and just stick it in your slug instead of?
Oh, I see what you mean. Right. So you're saying something like, instead of this being posts, it was like, I don't know, post slug equals layout templates, something like that.
Yeah, but instead of query string frames, like post dash layout templates.
Oh, I see what you mean. I think I actually had it like that. So layout templates, you're saying? Okay. So then, yeah, if we had something like that, then now the slug would be at the top level. So underneath app here. So it would be slug. And then we would have a page.tsx inside of that. And now the slug would include post hyphen in it. So it'd have to be able to split it or remove it to get the ID.
Smart enough to know, hey, this is going to be server-side rendered because we're playing around with, if we're fetching different data.
Well, no, it can still pre-render it because we would still. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So we could still pre-render them because we could still pre-render all the slugs because we know it's post dash what all the other slugs are. But for something like Kayak, that's a good example. Maybe they pre-render the top 100 cities, but they're not going to pre-render every entire city in the United States. So pre-render those, and then the other ones will just happen on demand. So if someone goes to the route, the first one is server-side rendered, like the regular SSR, but then everything else will be static site because it actually saves or caches that output. Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. That's something that happens often. I'm adding that to the talk, so thanks. Other questions? Okay, great. If you have any more questions, feel free. Yeah, whether it's you or anybody else.